Welcome to another edition of Learning with Human Kinetics. My name is Aaron, and today I'm going to talk about a subject that is always on the mind of trainers and coaches, sometimes considered by athletes and often debated by many. Should athletes train in season? Now, if you ask trainers or strength coaches, the answer is a resounding yes. You should train during the season. If you ask sport coaches, you might get mixed reactions. Some might say, no, I don't want them to get too tired or sore right before a game. You might also hear, why do they need to train? They just spent the entire off-season training. Now, if you ask athletes, you might also get mixed reactions. Some might sound similar to what a sport coach might say. Others might say that they want to train in season, but might be convinced otherwise, whether that's through a friend, a coach, a parent, whatnot. Now, if you ask a young athlete's parent if their son or daughter should train in season, you'll probably hear when. With so many practices and games mixed with school and homework, time is limited and training is usually the first to go. Now, none of those responses are new, and regardless of which side of the debate you're on, you've probably heard them all. So I want to start with a question here. Have you ever been on the verge of making a big decision about a career change or an important life event that you know needs to happen, but you just keep putting it off? You put it off because the timing isn't right, or at least you think the timing isn't right. If you've ever been in that situation and you ask for advice on what to do, a mentor might say, if not now, when? That is one of the arguments that Kevin Carr made in one of my recent author interviews when talking about the same topic. If you haven't seen it, it's up on YouTube now. You should go check it out. But the point he made is that so many athletes, whether they are multi-sport athletes or single-sport athletes, they play year-round. And if competition is ongoing, training should be ongoing too. If you play year-round and don't train in season, then his point is, when are you going to train? To that point, he also said that so many coaches and parents and athletes have bought into the idea of playing year-round and in some cases an excessive amount of games, but haven't yet bought into the one aspect that will help them continue to progress in their sport, and that is strength and power training. Now, we all know by now, especially if you're listening to this, that strength and power training will help an athlete get stronger and more powerful. We know that with our knowledge of anatomy and physiology. When we want to produce maximal force, all of the available motor units must be activated within a muscle. The firing rate or frequency of the motor unit activation can change, and that also affects the ability to generate force. So with increased motor unit firing rates, the muscle fibers are continually activated before they have time to completely relax. This is only possible through an adaptive mechanism which improves following heavy resistance training. Put into simpler terms, if we want to get more powerful and produce more force so that we can become more explosive, then we have to strength train. To the credit of many athletes at just about every level, more and more athletes are starting to train. They realize that in order to get better and to be the best they can possibly be, they need to work to get stronger, faster, and more powerful. Now, if you think about strength training in the bigger picture, it is still relatively new. This is still, in my opinion, one of the difficulties in comparing different eras of professional sports. It's tough to fairly compare pro basketball players in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s to pro basketball players in the early 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s. The most infamous debate, of course, and you've probably all heard this or been a part of it, is who is the greatest basketball player of all time? Now, some might say Bill Russell, some might say Michael Jordan, some might say Kobe Bryant, and others will say LeBron James. I'm not going to touch on that debate or get into that at all in this conversation, but a valid argument is the influence of strength and power development. Now, would average basketball players in the 70s, 80s, and 90s be even better with the knowledge that we have now in terms of strengthening the body and becoming more explosive? Skill development aside, the answer should be yes. Now, if you give an average athlete, and I say average in relative terms, the ability to train and get stronger and more powerful, they're easily going to be more competitive with the other athletes that have the same access to that type of training. Now, we know that strength training and sports performance training works. We don't have to look to the pro level to know that. I mean, I've seen that firsthand training athletes from 8 years old through college, and my experience probably isn't much different than yours if you're a trainer or a coach, or if you're on the other end as an athlete and have seen your own progress through training. Following a traditional periodization model, an athlete will go through a preparatory phase followed by a hypertrophy or strength endurance phase, a basic strength phase, and a strength and power phase. Now, breaking it down by sports seasons, this would be similar to an off-season phase, a preseason phase, and in-season. Now, the off-season phase would be considered the preparatory period. It typically lasts from the end of the postseason to the beginning of the preseason. Now, this is where most athletes get the bulk of their training in. Now, toward the end of their off-season, they'll transition to their preseason training, and this is typically when most athletes will begin practices, and if they have tryouts for their sport, that's when this will usually happen. Now, unfortunately for a lot of middle school and high school athletes, unless they have a strength and conditioning program at their school, this is where training begins to decline. If the athletes have been consistent, they have most likely gained a lot of strength, become more powerful, faster, and overall athletic. At this point, the athlete has done his or her job and is ready to go for the season, but the training shouldn't end. Seasons can be long, sometimes as long as 5 or 6 months, and the truth is, over time, the strength and power that athlete works so hard to gain will start to diminish sooner rather than later. If the plan is to peak at the beginning of the season, then you've done your job, but that usually isn't the case. As an athlete, you want to peak in time for the postseason. Think of it this way: if you're on an exercise or training plan for 4 months or more, and then you take 5 months off, what's going to happen? Do you maintain everything the entire time without training? Are you going to maintain your weight if the goal had been weight loss? Are you going to have as much muscle at the end of that 5 months of rest as you did at the end of your training plan if your goal was hypertrophy? That should be an easy one. The answer is no. So why would an athlete be much different? By taking time off during the season, you're essentially detraining. Now, detraining, according to the National Strength and Conditioning Association, is the term given to a decrement in performance and loss of the accumulated physiological adaptations following the cessation of anaerobic training, or when there is substantial reduction in frequency, volume, intensity, or any combination of those variables. According to the principles of reversibility, training-induced adaptations are transient and can disappear when the training load is insufficient or removed completely. The result is the loss of anatomical, physiological, and performance adaptations that have been made. Now, in general, performance gains can be maintained for about 4 weeks of inactivity. A study of trained weightlifters showed that removing the training stimulus for 14 days did not significantly affect 1 rep max strength in the bench press and squat, isometric and isokinetic contraction or concentric knee extension force, or vertical jump performance. In recreationally trained men, there was very little change during the first 6 weeks of detraining, and longer periods off from training saw much quicker declines in strength performance in strength-trained athletes. With respect to muscle fiber characteristics, following a break in training, fiber disruption remains unchanged during the initial weeks of inactivity, but oxidative fibers have been known to increase in strength-trained athletes and decrease in endurance athletes within 8 weeks of the end of training. The goal, of course, is to at least maintain strength and power throughout this season, and preferably gain strength and power in time for the postseason or any point when the athlete wants to peak. That can't be done if training is stopped during the season. At one point, I know an argument was made on social media that baseball pitchers don't need to train during the season because they actually get stronger by throwing more and get stronger as the season progresses. Now, that was met by a prominent and reputable baseball strength and conditioning coach who accurately replied, if Major League Baseball pitchers got stronger by throwing more, they would be their strongest at the end of the season with no injuries. Now, any coach or fan who watches baseball regularly knows that most baseball pitchers who throw a high volume of pitches, they tend to get tired, and most unfortunately get some type of injury or overuse inflammation at some point during the season. Now, this speaks to the idea that it isn't only strength that needs to be trained during the season. Connective tissue needs to be taken care of as well. So that means bone, tendons, ligaments, fascia, and cartilage. Those are all examples of connective tissue that are affected by strength training or lack of strength training in some cases. They're all complex and dynamic structures that are critical, the critical link between muscles and bones. Now, as muscles become stronger, they pull on their bony attachments with greater force and cause an increase in bone mass near the tendon. High-intensity anaerobic training actually results in the connective tissue growth, and those adaptations increase the tendon's ability to withstand greater forces. So think of this as not only strengthening, but a method of injury reduction. I did an entire Learning with Human Kinetics episode on sport injury reduction, so I would refer you to that for more information. Now, a study done in Norway looked at not only the importance of training in season, but training frequency and the effects that it had on professional soccer players. Now, the athletes in the study performed the same strength training program twice a week during a 10-week prep period. Think of that as the off-season training I mentioned earlier. Now, once the season began, one group of athletes had one strength maintenance session per week, and the second group had one training session every 2 weeks. The only difference between the two groups and the training sessions was the frequency of the training. Now, the study found that one strength training session per week during the first 12 weeks of the season maintained the initial gains in strength, speed, and power from the off-season prep. On the other hand, the group that trained only once every 2 weeks saw a reduction in strength and speed. Now, depending on the number of matches per week, the strength maintenance session in this case is recommended to be performed between 1 to 2 days after a match and 2 to 3 days before the next match. Now, we know that can't always happen depending on your sport. Now, additional research, however, has explored the idea of game day training. Now, this is known to be the case specifically in pro hockey, at least that I'm aware of, where time is very limited between games, practice time, and travel. So they end up training either earlier in the day or right after their game before they take off for the next city. The primary concern with pre-game resistance training is in the risk of inducing acute neuromuscular fatigue, which would be detrimental to performance hours later. Now, if the athlete's neuromuscular system is fatigued, there will be a decrease in performance, including maximal strength and muscular power. This is usually the case with high-volume resistance training. Now, low-volume resistance training, consisting of low-intensity power cleans and high-intensity squats, for example, showed little to no influence of neuromuscular fatigue on performance. In fact, it demonstrated enhanced total body muscular power 4 to 6 hours later in the day. Because of this, the case could be made for game day training using like Olympic lifts and explosive lower body movements using low volume. Now, as a general recommendation for maintenance, 2 days per week are still preferred in season in order to maintain strength and power and possibly progress to peak at the right time. Now, I have a small group of athletes who train year-round, and to avoid scheduling conflicts, they come in the morning to train before school. They're multi-sport athletes, so they're almost always in season, but they rarely see a drop in performance. In fact, they actually progress and get stronger and more powerful, even during their primary sport seasons, because we're careful to monitor their fatigue levels, and we use a progressive system and periodize their workouts so that they aren't doing the same thing or training at the same intensity year-round. Now, if time is limited though, hitting main lifts in a 30 to 45 minute session is enough to help maintain strength and power during the season. Now, assuming the athlete put in the work during their off-season and pre-season, 1 to 2 days per week along with monitoring workload and fatigue levels should be adequate. Managing workload and fatigue levels generally means increasing the intensity, like I said, but lowering volume during the training sessions. It's a fine line to walk because you want to maintain or increase your level of strength and fitness during the season and during your sessions, but too much intensity could mean an increase in fatigue and decrease in performance. But if handled properly, though, the athlete won't be too tired on game day, won't be sore, and will actually be stronger and better prepared for competition. So there are a number of ways to approach training, but for the best results, both research and anecdotal evidence points toward the many benefits of training in season. For more information on the benefits of training, check out my previous episodes of Learning with Human Kinetics on sports injury reduction, periodization, muscle fibers, and training for power. There are many other resources available, like the NSCA's Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning, and don't forget our research journals. You can find those online at journals.humankinetics.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on all of our social media channels, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok, and follow and subscribe on YouTube. And when you do, make sure to hit that bell so that you can get alerts whenever we upload a new video. And if you aren't already, make sure to subscribe to our emails. We have newsletters for multiple categories like fitness, strength and conditioning, coaching, and other niche topics. So thanks again for joining me today, and remember that when managed properly, the benefits far outweigh the detriments when it comes to in-season training.